Good evening, wherever you are. Is the image up back there? Isn't it? So I forgot to bring the image here, so I'll describe it to you. So the image that's on the screen, wherever the rest of the world is two images. One is of a man who's, I think he's got his hand over his mouth. It's kind of contracted, holding. And the other is a very beautiful woman covered in honey. It's a nice image. Sorry that I don't have it. The caption on this, it's not what you think, boys. The caption next to the man who's holding on and contracting is Suppression. And the caption next to the woman who's covered in honey is Indulgence. In between, there's a point of light. And what it says there is stillness is the balance point. This came out of a conversation I had with somebody recently who asked the question about indulgence versus suppression. And of course, the first thing that comes to mind is sex. Okay. About ice cream. So what I want to say is that it doesn't really make a difference what it is that we're talking about, whether it's sexual drive, whether it's mental and emotional dynamics, whether it's the drive to be rich, etc. Because we're tantrikas, then of course it's easy to say, well, tantrika is a non-dual path, which means that everything is all part of one thing. And unfortunately, that's often used as a platform for, well, I can do anything I want. There's not good, there's not bad. And in the absolute sense, of course, that's true. The point I want to make to you, and when I make the statement that stillness is the balance point, is that all of our actions should first be filtered through a place of centeredness in ourselves, a place of stillness, a place of insight, so that we recognize whatever the urge is, whatever the need is, whatever the drive is, that we don't act on that. We don't act to suppress it, and we don't act to indulgent, if you will, until we have taken a breath and centered ourselves in the heart and used the insight of the heart to know where that action is arising from. And then the stillness is the conscious filter that we use to know whether to engage in the action or whatever that might be, including, you could use the word suppression, but really it's the conscious act of not acting on energies that will decenter us. That's not acting from a place of incompleteness or grasping. And the same on the other extreme, that we don't indulge from a place that's really the same place of incompleteness that's trying to fill itself up with honey. What's really important that we understand is that all actions are energy. All actions, whether it's suppression or indulgence, whether it's contraction or overextending, is what we're doing with our energy. And what we're doing with our energy is what we are doing with our own consciousness. So then we make the conscious choice to be conscious, to not act as soon as the urge arises. Whether that's the urge to compress, whether that's the urge to grasp, whether it's an urge that comes up out of profound, deep self-rejection, or the blowing our trumpets of arrogance in ourselves, then it becomes clear whether to act or not to act. And mostly because it becomes clear where the need to act is coming from. Most of the time our actions are unconscious. We get an itch and we're going to scratch it, right? And the problem is how often that creates, you can say, a backlash in our own life. A backlash in the sense that we are perhaps acting from some self-serving, some willful place that unfortunately usually has some unfortunate circumstances for the people around us. But what we don't really recognize, it has the same unfortunate circumstances for our own self when we act from a place of unconsciousness. What we're really doing is compacting that contracted awareness from which we are acting. And so we must have the intelligence to understand our own internal environment and to connect that to, if you will, the external environment, because this is how we free ourselves from the idea that what's happening in us and what's happening out there are two different things. And usually our actions in the world are driven by some misunderstanding in ourselves, some incompleteness in ourselves. And so as soon as we grasp, as soon as we indulge, right, in trying to complete ourselves in that which cannot complete us, we are perpetuating that level of that self, that experience of incompleteness in ourselves. So it's not about suppressing our emotions. How are you going to suppress emotions? How are you going to not feel your emotions? They grab you by your private parts and they shake you around, they throw you against the wall, and they stomp on you. How are you going to deny that, right? Our thoughts do the same thing in a little bit with a different resonance to it, right? So it's not to deny it in the sense of suppressing them, but it is to recognize that the different dimensions of our limited consciousness, of our limited identity, the different dimensions, if you will, of ego, operate within those rules, within those dynamics. And so to indulge or not to indulge, to suppress or not to suppress, the answer to whether to do or not to do always is inside when we don't act, when we don't reach, we don't suppress, we don't deny, but first take a breath inside, and really that still point that I said, the still point is the point of balance. The still point is surrender. Maybe you are really driven by, okay, we'll use sex because it's what grabs everybody, right? Whatever it is, right? There's nothing wrong with that. To suppress it creates its own problems. To indulge in it creates probably more problems. But the still point is the surrendering of that. And since those are both two extremes, if you will, of the movement of energy, the surrendering is then the internalization of the energy that we are about to act, either to suppress or indulge, and turning it back inside, channeling it back into the central channel, and allowing it to purify and refine itself. So that's always us internalizing. That's always us reconnecting to that point of consciousness in ourselves that can make clear decisions, that's not driven by misunderstanding. And if we look at our own lives, we can probably look at, well, if you're 70, you can look at least at the last 55 years. Until you're 15, you have no chance of being conscious and making conscious choices. And I realize there's flexibility in that. Sometimes it's 7, sometimes it's 27. Where we start to have enough maturity to make these choices. But the point is, we can probably all, if we're honest with ourselves, look back at the actions of suppression or the actions of indulgence that really didn't turn out the way we want them to be. That while we might have got something, we lost a lot. That's what I mean by being still and conscious in before you act. The extraordinary gift of life is the ability to be conscious. And yet it's a conscious act to function from that consciousness. And so then it's never a question of denying. We don't deny our humanity, but let's not deny our divinity by overindulging in our humanity. There is, if there is only one pure consciousness, one pure absolute freedom, then there's nothing that's good or bad, that's contracting or opening. And here's a secret. When we come in contact with that place in ourselves, then the question doesn't even arise. Do I indulge? Do I suppress? Right? Because the clarity of that free energy, that free consciousness, is what perpetually informs our actions. So that's what I want you to really think about, is make sure that a deeper consciousness in you is informing your actions before you act, whatever it is. And in some ways, quote, overindulgence is as debilitating as suppression. We're never suggesting that we should deny our humanity, that we should deny it. We have mind, we have emotions, we have needs. Just be conscious of that before you act. The entire, one of the most exalted of the non-dual tantric practices is the discussion of spanda, the imperceptible movement of consciousness. That's what spanda means. And the fundamental practice, which is extraordinarily powerful and yet hard to practice, is the being aware of the arising and subsiding of energy. We can specifically say the arising and subsiding of thought, or emotions, or need. And the still point is the place in us that watches it arise and subsides. And rises and subsides. It's like watching the ocean out there. My favorite thing to do in watching the ocean is to look past the vastness or the bigness of the ocean, and to kind of, then on that you see the waves on the ocean, but if you really watch, you see the pulsation of the ocean. The rising and subsiding of that awareness, of that dynamic, right? Of which the waves, big, little, are happening on the surface of that. The practice that I'm sharing with you that arises in spanda is that stillness that is centered enough, still enough to see whatever arises and subsides, that we don't have to act on it. And what you will probably notice is most of it, whether it's the need to suppress, the need to reject, or the need to indulge, if you just realize that A, it's energy, that it mostly will arise and subside, and then it'll dissipate. Which in no way suggests to us, don't be alive. Be alive with consciousness. Good night, everyone.